Father Paul asked us to just prepare some kind of a teaching on the state of the church today, where we are. So anyway, this may seem a little disjointed and whatnot, but I just wanted to kind of bring to you, he asked, to talk about like the state of the church in general, as well as our church and the world that we live in, and what we are asked to participate in. As a church, we don't live in a bubble. We don't live separated. We are in the world, but not of the world. So we have to realize that we are a part of everything that goes on around us, and always will be. It'd be nice if you could live your life within these four walls and continuously be on holy ground, separated from the world, and not have to go out there and deal with it, but we do. And so we just put down some thoughts and notes, and hope it's beneficial for all of us. But as a church, where my mind went right away is the fact that we are expected to participate in the world that's around us. We often hear the saying, separation of church and state, that the church has no business being involved in government, in the governing of things. We should be totally caught up in what we do here, living in the spiritual life, in the spiritual world. And unfortunately, it's not really true. The saying that they came up with in our government is, of course, the separation of church and state, which in reality, when you go back to it, the whole reason that the founders wrote that in there was the fact that they did not want to allow the government that they were forming to be able to come in and dictate what religion you could worship, what your religion believed in, what your religion practiced. It wasn't the fact that there shouldn't be religion in government, it was to keep government out of religion. And so that's the fact where that comes from. You'll often hear people say, there shouldn't be prayer in school. Well, you shouldn't get to have a nativity down at the county courthouse. You shouldn't be able to have those things because of separation of church and state, separation. And that's not what it's about. And so we have to realize that despite everything that we go through today, we need to be involved in the government of our nation. And if you go back, you find out that all civilizations find religious laws have been mixed in with the governing of people from the very beginning of time. The earliest governments that were ever formed, you find that what were they based on? What were the laws based on? But the morals and the principles that came out of religious beliefs. No matter if it was Taoism or Islam or Christianity or Judaism, any way you look at it, all law, all governing bodies ended up having to be based on the facts. And the most important one, the most obvious to us, of course, is if you go back in Jewish history, and we have it right in the Bible. And you see that everything was based on Mosaic law. The entire government that they practiced in and started with and began with came out of the commandments, all the health laws, everything that you read through in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, everything you'll go back and find was all based, their whole law that they lived and practiced. And they still talk today, the Jewish people, the rabbis, about the yoke of the law. And the yoke of the law was not something that they took on as a burden, but the yoke of the law, they still say it today, it's a protection. It's a protection from the other governments that existed back in those days, because they were all dictatorships, kings, lords, people that took advantage of people. Whereas the yoke of the law, the Jewish Torah, the laws that they practiced, protected the people. And that's what's supposed to be. That's what the governing bodies are supposed to be, as a protection for all of us. And so, just going back into the Bible, you find when people say, don't get involved in government, well, what is the book of Judges? What is the book of Kings? It's all about government. All the way through you find government. You find Josiah coming out and tearing down the high places, all of the false idols, the things that people raise up in their life, whether it be the government or churches, individuals, other religions, it's always about getting back to what? The basic core beliefs that we have in Christianity. In their time, it was, of course, Judaism. So governments always end up, throughout history, using religion then to pervert and to subvert the will of the people. And so from the history standpoint, you always find power, greed, all of the things that raise their ugly head, all of the negative morality that governments take from religion and twist it and use it to control people. And that's because man is a sinner. It's where we were born, and it's where we struggle to get out of all of our life. And it's no different than with governments. So what happens in the history of man that starts to change things and continues through today? And it's the fact that man makes covenant with God. And the fact that man makes covenant with God is what brings God's favor into the lives that we lead. And it's all throughout the history. I've got several books. My wife was saying, are you going to show some of the books that you read? Things that happened throughout the history of just this nation, where God took what we did, used miracles, and twisted it around to guide and direct the government in this nation and this country. And I have several I could tell you about. But you look at the very beginning and the founding of it, and it was the Pilgrims that came and landed. And they came for what? Religious freedom. Freedom from what they were being persecuted as. If you read the history of them over there, the struggles that they were going through looking for that freedom that they sought so hard. And they were being persecuted terribly over there. Terrible persecution for practicing what their religion was. They weren't coming to try to form a nation. They just were looking for freedom from that, to be able to practice with God what they did. Half of the Pilgrims died on the way over. The first winter that they spent here, half of what was left died. They were down to a quarter of their original. Do you think that you and I today would feel as though, well, this is God's blessing on us?
Yeah, right.
I'd be pretty downcast. And there's one fellow that when you read the history, it's a great story to read. One fellow out of all of them who had lost his own son brought together the people and said, we are here to make history. We are here to found this country. But in order to do so, we need to make covenant with God. We don't want God to come over on our side. We need to get on God's side. And so they struck a covenant. And you can actually pull it up online and you can read the covenant that this man wrote. He was not a preacher. But it's astounding what he wrote about dedicating the nation to the pursuit of being founded upon God and His beliefs and His core beliefs. The truths that you find in the Word of God. Not some specialized government with a Congress and a presidency and a Senate and all of the laws and all the rest of it. It all had to do with one thing. We seek to get on God's side. And we believe in what we're doing. And that's something that carries throughout the history of this country. And this is all background I'm just giving you, but you find out that George Washington, you often see the picture of him at Valley Forge. He left the people. The army was in socks with holes in it. They were ready to be totally defeated, and he snuck off with his horse into the woods, and he knelt down and he prayed aloud to the God. And one man followed him secretly that lived in the area and listened to that prayer. And he was asking God's mercy on not him, not his men, but on the nation. And the Revolutionary War was won, not because of man, not because of 2 by night, 3 by sea, and all the different stories that we hear, but because of God's divine intervention in what happened here. And the first thing that George Washington did when he was elected president was he took from that very room where they had cast the lots and did the vote, he took the entire governing body and he marched them down the street. And they went to that little church, a church that stands today right next to where the Twin Towers fell. And they went into that church and prayed for hours. Not an hour, for hours they sat and prayed. And he made covenant with God for this nation, that it would not be founded on the governments that we have to live in and we have to see around us, but that it would always be founded on and struck to the fact that this nation needs to be founded in God and his principles. You find it again with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, they were losing the war. The North was losing battle after battle, and when they came to Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln felt so strongly that there was one way to change things, that he came to Gettysburg and he gave his address, but he made a covenant with God there. And it's written about it. Again, you can read this. He's made covenant with God that he would get rid of slavery. He would do everything he could for this nation to turn around, that God would heal the nation, that he would bring it back together, and that this nation would continue to find its footing. It was where the beginning of the very Republican Party began back then. They were called, at that point, they were the Whig Party. And there was nothing happening good. And at that point, and I'm not praising Republicans, I'm just saying this was the beginning, the foundation of the Republican Party. And the whole idea of it was they called themselves the Wide Awakes. Yeah. And the Wide Awakes came forth and they started to see what was going on with slavery, what was going on with the nation, what was going on with the division, and that God needed to get his hand involved in this. We needed to, again, get back on God's side. Because we get caught up in everything else. We find ourselves straying and going off in other directions. From the point that he made the covenant with God, they lost one battle in the rest of the Civil War. And the nation was turned, and it was the beginning of freedom from slavery. Stories like that abound. I've read books on some of the history, and it's amazing some of the things that have happened. And now today, we find that Christianity has started to go to sleep. It's probably been 60 or 70 years that we've saw the church slowly fade away from a lot of the beliefs, the core truths, the things that we've always followed. The society, our culture, all of the things that we've supposedly have to stand for, we have found that they have basically drifted away out of our very nature as a church. And some people believe it's okay. Some people believe that that's all right, that the church needs to learn to blend in more than to be something that's old-fashioned or stand out. And the opposite's actually true. The world today needs the church to be involved in society, in day-to-day life, and not be taking this set-aside back seat. The nation would do well, again, if we made covenant with God. There's actually things that are going on today in the nation where several churches, several groups are, again, making covenant now with God, that we would turn from the direction that we've been going, how we've fallen asleep, how we've let things go the easy route, and we've changed things. It's not a matter of Democrat versus Republicans or progressives versus conservatives, capitalism versus socialism, socialism versus communism, all of that stuff that comes apart. All of those are just distractions. See, today the mask is off. The mask is off, and we are again recognizing good versus evil. It's light versus darkness. When Leo was talking about linear thinking, well, history started here, and we're going here, and we're going here, he's exactly right. It's circular. We go around and around and around. There's nothing new under the sun, right, Leo? We repeat history over and over again, hence the old saying, he who does not learn from history is doomed to repeat it, because around goes the circle. So what we do is, now we recognize that Satan's mask is off. No longer does he hide what he's doing. He's being blatantly obvious with it, in the face of not just the people, but the church. And what does the church do with it? Worldwide, some of the things that you're seeing. And if you look around, you cannot deny this. You see nations practicing organ harvesting. Literally taking whole groups of people and taking them in prison, and while they're alive, cutting out the organs of people and selling them on the black market to be able to have organ transplants. You see people having the sex trafficking of adults and children. It's right out in the open. It's on the internet. It's all nationwide, all over the world. They're saying the United Nations or the United States is one of the worst for child sex trafficking. More being done here than anywhere. And do you hear the churches talking about it? Do you see the church being involved in helping? Now in Canada, they have assisted suicide for people of any age. You can be a 9-year-old child, and if you say you feel like you want to die, you don't have a reason to live, do you know that they don't give you counseling? They actually come to you and they say to the child, we will help you commit suicide. And they don't even ask the parents to be involved. This is the darkness, this is the evil that's being flaunted in front of the church, in front of the government, in front of people, and people sleep. There's forced population control. Food restrictions. They don't want you to use nitrogen or fertilizers because they might harm the environment. So if people starve to death by the millions, they don't care. It just happened in Sri Lanka. The whole half of the nation was starving to death because they won't allow them to use fertilizers to be able to grow enough food to be able to feed their people. Government's taking control of children from parents. It's right here. If your child wants to have sex change, get them to California. Take them to California, and the parent can't get there and take them back. They're under the control of the government, and the government can do what they want. This list goes on and on and on of all of the things that are going. Science now promoting disease manipulation. The COVID virus, created by scientists trying to discover some new, not discover, create a new disease. And then using the population of the world to experiment on. Untested vaccines, gender manipulation, social engineering, all of the things that you can't turn your blind eye to as a church. And you feel helpless. And you say to yourself, don't we have laws? Don't we have laws about it? But you come to realize in today's world that a law is only a law if the people in power choose to enforce it. If the people that are in power like you, are you friend or are you foe? Are you on our side or not? And so you start to realize that the governments that we have to live in and that we have to live with are what we end up having to live under. What you choose, what you do, makes a difference. Whether you get involved, whether you, in your life, in any way that you can, get involved, makes the difference. Evil does not respect or emulate good. I'll say it again. Evil does not respect or emulate good. It mocks it, it hates it, and it seeks to destroy it. And if you believe, if you're in this room and you believe that there's nothing you can do to stop it, if you think you can ignore it, if you think you can participate in some other area and not have to have anything to do with it, then evil is already won. It requires something out of all of us. God does do the battling. God does do the battling. God is absolute power. But in the 7 decades, probably since the 60s, when you go back and look at it, where we grew up in that, many people here, free love, drugs, the hippie generation, that was the beginning of the falling away. Soon it was taking prayer out of school. Soon it was turning the other direction. The morality started to slip and things started to go. It's the tearing away of the cultural and the spiritual fabric of a nation that we live in today. The church has not only gone to sleep, but it allows evil to operate, not just out there, but in the midst of the church. In the midst of the church. We've witnessed the fading away of holiness. Remember, Eddie used to talk about how the nuns are laying down their garb and everything's starting to get set down, and Eddie said, look how the Lord's allowing us to pick it back up. How the priesthood is disappearing. The priests don't say Mass every day. All of the things that are going away from it. And Eddie said, but God has created a priesthood. A priesthood to pick up holiness. Holiness meaning separation unto God. I'd like to have Leo get the pictograph for holiness. And see what you create with that. Separated unto God. And again we see, are we maintaining commandments and core beliefs and principles? The world wants to tell us today it's old-fashioned. It's out of step. It's not hip. It's not current. To what? Come in garb. It's not current to not have sex until you're married. It's not a firm belief. Transgenderism, all of the rest of it that you encounter today, you have to accept everybody. You can't dare to offend anybody. He's talking about identity. Think of what you could do with that one word, identity. With all of these people that are struggling so badly to know who they are. And they find themselves in all of the struggles in their mind, the battleground, with struggling with their identity and the choices that are being made for them and the choices that they're being pressured into through our own education systems. Then you look at church beliefs now have to be molded to fit into the now culture. Our words have to tickle the ear. We have to make people feel wanted and included, and so that we don't offend anybody. God forbid that someone's not going to get saved if we don't tell them what you're doing is okay. There really aren't truths in there that you have to follow. It's good if you can, but they're not necessary. Sister Joanne always uses the line with me, show me one place in Scripture where Jesus was politically correct. You're not going to find it. He spoke truth. And he stood for truth. And that's exactly where the church needs to stay today. We've all been to churches that have listened to, or we've all been to churches or listened on TV to preachers that preach some message where the word seems so watered down or twisted that, do you find nourishment in it? Do you find truth in it? Can you find growth in it? Or does it actually become almost a block or a false path that you're led down because the message isn't what it's supposed to be? I've actually been to a church where I went up for communion and the priest, was handing out the hosts on a paten, and they were spilling off of the paten and rolling across the floor. And I wanted to get down on the floor and gather them up. I was so offended by what was happening. And actually when I got up there, they took their foot and pushed them aside so that you didn't step on it when you got to them. So where the beliefs are, or where the holiness is, or where things are in the churches today, it's hard to say, depending on where you go. And so we've allowed, as a church, I feel like, darkness not only to gain a foothold, but actually darkness is in control in so many areas in the world today. One of the biggest ones that we've all seen just in the last month is the anti-Semitism. And again, we come back to Leo's theory of the circle. It's the circle. There's nothing new. Everything that they're saying, everything that they're going against the Jewish people with, that we're living in today, and you're watching every day on your TV with the marches and the protests, it's all the same. It's the same stories. Do you know that the second most written about subject is anti-Semitism? That if you go back in history, you can find the writings thousands of years ago coming against the Jewish people of God. And there's been tons of it. And they just keep regurgitating the same old stories, the same old conspiracies, the same old things, and we're going around and around and around again. And we're back into it again. Those things aren't going to change. They just keep coming back at you. So what does it all mean? God does have absolute power, but we're told we're not supposed to be a sideline combatant. You can't sit on the side and just watch everything that goes on and not be a part of it. Think of the early church. Think of the apostles. If they'd all sat in the upper room and said, we're sure glad Jesus did what he did. Now let's see what happens. Leo's always all about, we need to move forward. We need to get something done. We need to get out there. We need to do something. We need to quit looking back. We need to have motion. We need to have goals. We need to push. And that's exactly right. It's what they did. You think they watched what happened to Jesus and then they realized when he started, they go back in their mind and started thinking, the cup that I drank of, you also will drink of? The things that he told them that they were not going to happen? That's all a part of what we've agreed to do in this priesthood. It's what we've promised. The vows that we'll go up and repeat again tomorrow. The commitment that we'll all make in our hearts to continue to move forward. It's all about pushing ahead in what? The priesthood of Melchizedek. Not the Aaronic priesthood from the Old Testament, but the priesthood of Melchizedek that Leo teaches about. You should be knowledgeable on what's going on around you. How many people actually read about what's happening in the state or the local or your federal governments? How many people really take time to study the people that you're putting into office, the people that you're electing to represent you? How many of you are voting on party, or I like this guy's snappy remarks, or I like this one's tweets, or I like the way this guy looks, or I love the showmanship? How many are voting on that rather than on your interior? How many of you are going inside like Leo was preaching about in prayer? What's your worldview? What is the candidate's worldview? What are the things that they stand for? What is their track record? What can they stand on? What do we stand on? We stand here on the shoulders of those that came before us. Whether from the Pilgrims all the way on in this nation, all the way up to the founding of our church, Eddie, and the eldership, and the very first priesthood that Father Paul here was a part of. We all stand on the shoulders of these people. Some of us were there for that. We may not have been in the first priesthood, but they were from all those years back. We stand trying to push forward on what was built there in those days. That's what we're here for after 40 years. You need to make intelligent choices on who you're voting for. You need to feast on his word, what Leo was saying. I can't stress it enough. Sit down when you go home and think to yourself, how much time do I spend on my Facebook? How much time am I on Twitter? How much time am I going through TikTok, watching clever videos? How much time am I in my work? Where are you going to get your nourishment? You are what you eat. What you're feeding your spirit is what comes back out the other side. And are you invested in prayer? I had no idea what Leo was going to talk about. Are you invested in prayer? The world wants to invest in 401ks. How big a one have you got, Lee?
I'm hoping the community makes it.
There you go. Your IRAs, all the things that the world tells you to build up, invest in everything you can. Greatest investment, he taught it. It's in your prayer life. It's learning yourself. Because in that, You yoke yourself with God. You put yourself on that side. As a church and a Franciscan order that we carry here, and a priesthood, we're currently working on expanding our online outreach. Leo will be able to tell you about that. In order that we can connect with innumerable people. The future is wide open for that. And he's made presentations to the board of directors, and it's something that we're moving ahead on, that we're looking for participation in order to start to outreach to people that we can't get in these little places that we have. We can start to open up a direction. We're not going to be bringing another watered down milquetoast gospel message. If that's what starts to go out on that, I'll go crazy. I can turn on TBN and all these other networks and I can get plenty of that. But we're hoping to be able to have something where, like he's teaching, meat. Something that we can put out to the people that they can feel that they are a separated people. Something where people can tune into and find something they're not getting everywhere else. Something that the Spirit of God can move upon and create. And that He will always be able to move us in directions that we need to go. He's done thing after thing with this situation, people coming into Leo's path that have opened our eyes to a lot of stuff. And we need prayer and we need people behind it, what he was talking about, meditation. Yes. All of those things are going to be a part of trying to back up what the few people, I'm not good at that stuff. Leo says, I can't build anything. And I'm talking internet stuff. But he said he can run it. But we need people to build it. Not only people from here, but we'll have to hire people to help us to build something. Something to move forward with that's going to create an ability, a platform, a launching pad for us to be able to move out and to gather people that can't find the Lord, because like Leo says, they're all over the world. And he'll tell you later, he'll tell you after this, things that are happening, people that are tuning in, people that are finding God through the online presence. Get invested in God. Offer Him your giftings, your time, and your life. Channel your energy into learning what pleases Him. If you do that, you'll find your own spiritual garden blooming. Christianity is a participation sport. It's not sit on the couch, it's participation. It takes energy, it takes time, it takes commitment. I look at the Lord told me the widow with the 2 mites. He brought that into my mind when I wrote that line down. And he said, she only had 2 mites to offer, but she gave it willingly. And I wanted to look about the mites. So I did what Leo says. I went back into the Word and I looked at mites. And it says 2 small coins. But when you go back to the root, and then when you go back and you start to investigate it, it turns out it was nothing more than a flake. She literally took a coin and had scraped a flake off of the coin. And you find out that's what people did back then. They would shave a little bit off of a coin and have nothing but a flake. And that was worth something. It wasn't even enough to be a coin, but a flake. And she had 2 of them. And this woman said, I've got nothing to give. Do you ever feel like you have nothing to offer? Do you feel like you're old or you're decrepit or I'm sick or I have a family or I'm marching around with a walker or I just don't seem to have what I used to have? She was able to take those 2 flakes, and you can go a lot of direction with it, but she got out of her kitchen. She got out of her house. She traveled all the way there to the temple and said, I've got something to offer. And I'm going to go beyond myself, beyond my flesh. And though it's the last things that I have, I'm putting it in. That's the kind of spirit that we need to have in the church. It may seem like nothing to people that look. She passed by everybody. Not one person, I guarantee you, saw what she gave or cared except him. Jesus was the only one to comment. He was the only one to see. So when you feel like you've got nothing, remember, you've always got something to offer. Our church still maintains and believes in the safety that God led us to create in Conneautville. It was prophesied through Eddie years and years ago that he gave us that place, not to hunt, not to have a place for a youth camp, but to be a safety, because one day in the future we would need it. He prophesied that it watched to the south. He prophesied a lot of things, and when you go back and you read them, you will always find that little by little, the prophecies fall into place. The church still maintains up there. The church still talks about what we can do to continue to build and to lay a foundation there. Because Eddie always said, not everybody, some people, when time gets bad, they talk of the end times. Who knows when that is? But when times would get bad, some people will choose to go there, to get out of the urban living that we are stuck in when things become a point that you can't. That we wanted to have a place. And why? It wasn't just to indulge the people that go there. The idea of it was to be able to have people come out of that time and to be able to come back for the continuation of the priesthood. Amen, Paul? Mm-hmm. It was all about being able to bring back the Melchizedek priesthood, the teachings that we are being given, the holiness of the Eucharist, the belief in the Word of God. All of that we have, whoever would be there could be able to bring that back into the world that would need it. We still stand on that and extend our works towards that. And yet we find, like true Israelites, all the memories of the miracles and the prophecies and all the wonderful times that we had here in the green years, you want to call them that? When the place was humming and the place was packed and you couldn't get into the backyard up there. You sat under tables at prayer meetings. All of those things have faded away from our memories, and we find ourselves too often starting to fall away or just get lazy. We're lured by comforts that we find out in the life around us. We find ourselves lured in by technologies, our screens, our computers, our phones, all the things that distract us, take us away from what we're doing here this weekend. Prisoners to our flesh, to our medical conditions, and really more often than I care to admit, I don't know about you, but I leave this room and go into the kitchen and I forget what I went in there to get. And that's just a part of living. Those are all things that distract us from what we're supposed to be doing. But in the end, it's your heart that needs to rule you. What Leo was talking about, the Lord's in there. He's in there. We can't be ruled by our minds. We can't be ruled by the darkness that's around us. We can't be ruled by a government that wants to take us in another direction. At the same time, you can't sit on the sideline and just point the finger and say, go get him, God. I don't have any role in this. I have no part of it. As a sinner, you came to Christ with a heart of flesh. Some of us were broken. That was me. Some of us were lonely. Some of us empty. Just an empty place in there that something else had to be there. Some of us were searching. Father Paul searched all over he traveled around the world. But the same God that received the heart of flesh that you came to him with, that day of salvation that you experienced in your life, the same God that received that heart of flesh, the same God that healed that heart and then grew that heart, the same God that tilled the ground inside of you, that limed the soil, that planted the seed, that seed of faith that he gave you, that fertilizes it, that waters it through the teachings that you get here and the experiences that you have. That very same God that then weeded the garden in your heart says to you today, I am not done with you. I am invested in you. And I desire a return for the talents that I have given you. Amen.
Amen.